On the 11th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me. The Pipes, or Mother's Ire, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Once upon a time, in a land far away and forgotten by all who still draw breath, there was a town without neighbor or friend, and whose residents had long forgotten how they came to be there. But they were happy to be there, for they had their own customs and ways, their own times and celebrations, and their own trials and dangers, which kept them locked in the borders of their little town. Mostly. Now, in the southeast of the town there thrived the marketplace, and on its outskirts, where peddlers often brought their wares into the streets on carts great and low, there was one such peddler, near empty of his stuffs. Likewise there was a boy of 14 with long auburn hair and keen brown eyes that caught hold of the peddler and hadn't let him go all afternoon. His name was Benjamin Allen, but lately people called him Ben. So, with the sun dipping in the autumn sky and children gathering at the peddler's call for the final sale of his pipes, Ben thought it good to stay back and let the rest of the children buy as they wished. Once they'd all taken their pipes, 10 simple wooden things, Ben crossed the little court to the peddler, catching his wheeled cart with a hand before the man could escape. "Have you any more pipes?" "Sorry, son, those are my last. None even at my table. But come in a few days and I might have a few more carved." "Surely there's at least those you wouldn't normally sell. The ugly ones, the broken," Ben suggested, stepping back a bit and pulling his coats around himself. His father's things were still so big on him, no matter how flattering. "Forgive me, but by the look of you, you're no street rat. Surely you'd rather a pipe of brass. I know a fellow not far from my table who sells the most beautiful metal flutes. Come." "You give no offense. You're not entirely wrong, but I have no money for fine things." He gestured to his father's coat, then spread it open to show his commonest clothes, a simple, undyed shirt and dark woolen trousers puffing around his legs before gathering into old boots. "This is something left over from better times. Times I don't really know." The peddler nodded as if he understood. "Hard times fall on everyone, lad. Fret nothing of it. What goes down can come up again, if you know how to throw it." He examined the coat, a crimson thing that hung like a cape with arms, hemmed in dark fur with a stiff collar. "That's a fine thing. Simple, but fine. Well, mayhap I have something left after all." The peddler stepped around his cart and rummaged in the cabinets before he sprung up, adjusting his woolen cap against the sudden breeze through the streets. They both cursed, and the man laughed. "Keep that in your mouth, and your mother will call you a street rat, boy." Ben laughed. "Perhaps, but my uncles don't seem to mind." Then he gestured to the basket in the man's hand. The peddler found it as if he'd forgotten. "Oh, yes, here. These are the ones I can't seem to get to sing, the broken bits and ugly children, as it were." Ben smiled and leant over the cart to push past a few pipes until he saw one against the wall. It was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, with just enough holes to play a handful of notes, and its shape wasn't quite right, but the peddler had carved it from beautiful dark timber that reminded him of his old home in the Northwood. He pulled it out, holding it up to his face with a grin. "Why would you buy something that's broken?" a girl asked. Ben lowered the pipe and found her a couple paces away, her hands on her hips with a grin on her pretty face, the wind tossing her braided blonde hair and patched cape alike. "Why shouldn't I?" he asked, facing her with his grin. "It's broken," she said matter-of-factly. "I wouldn't waste my money on something that was broken." "No, but don't sway the boy off a buy, girl." "Well, you know, he likes it. Then he can have it. It would have profited me nothing anyway. Have it as a gift, for the coming harvest festival, boy." Ben found him with a smile. "Truly?" The peddler nodded. "Thank you, sir. I shall tell many people of your pipes to make up for this." Then Ben pocketed the pipe and bowed his head to the peddler as another gust came down, tossing open his coat and gripping him in icy teeth. "It'll be cold tonight, boy. Get home and warm by a fire." Then the peddler was off. "And you, sir." "Wait," the girl said. She couldn't have been more than 16 years, and dressed no finer than anyone else there. Simple dress and boots, beneath her cape and hood, but she acted a queen. "What will you do with it? Tell me." "Why?" "I wish to know. There's no sense in taking garbage as a gift, boy." She smirked and pulled her cape shut from inside. He chuckled and shrugged his shoulders. "Why, I might do all manner of things with it. But what is mine is mine. Enjoy your evening, girl." He gave a bow, smirking, and turned with a flourish of his coat before he jogged between vendors to his home, a manse overlooking Broad Road, across from the market. There, he returned his coat to his father, and heeded the peddler's advice, sitting on the floor beside the fire with his boots off, as his aunts, Lyda and Magdalene, fussed with their year-old babes on the old chairs beside. He sat cross-legged and turned the little pipe in his fingers until Aunt Magdalene asked after it, prompting him to tell the whole story and ending by holding it up for her to take. She held it in the firelight and twirled it between her fingers like a fat pencil, just out of reach of her curious son, before passing it to Aunt Lyda and back to Ben. "You should see if you can fix it, Ben," Aunt Magdalene said, bouncing her boy on her knee. "It's a pretty thing. You were smart to seek it out." "I think I shall, Auntie. Thank you. Do you think I could do it before the harvest festival?" "Mayhap," Aunt Magdalene said. "You're a strong-willed boy, Ben. Put your mind to it, and you could do just about anything." Aunt Lyda said. "What's all this?" his mother asked as she entered, finding Ben and stooping to brush his head and kiss him. Ben told her his story and showed her the pipe, pulling her lips into a smile as she returned him his instrument and sat beside Aunt Lyda. "She's right. I think you can fix it by festival." "Then I'll get started now." He hopped up, but his mother stopped him and told him to wait for supper. Then the night would be his. And he did wait until he was up in his chambers, young cousin Bartholomew snoring like a beast as he tinkered with the little pipe. He blew it, but there was no sound, so he looked inside and studied it until sunrise, when there was nothing left to study. And day after day he fiddled and tinkered with his pipe, sometimes going back to the peddler and asking him about the reed and the shape and smoothness of the barrel. And there he would always find the girl, watching him and asking after his plans for the pipe. "Have you given up on that thing yet?" she would ask. "When you abandon that awaiting failure, be sure to give it to me. I could always use more kindling." Yet he always answered her with a grin and assured her that he wouldn't give up until it was the finest pipe anyone had ever heard. But of course, the girl only rolled her eyes and reminded him that until that day, hers was a pipe that at least played. Then she would promptly set it to her mouth and make it sing with a deft dance of her fingers. This happened often, as Ben returned to the vendor to learn more about the pipes and how he could make it work, again and again, and each time the girl was there and watching for the perfect time to let in her snide remarks. Until, 2 weeks later, and with 3 days until the festival, Ben had sat back against his bed after supper and looked at the newly reeded pipe. He'd reshaped it until it was smooth and comely. He'd polished it, set a brazen mouthpiece at one end, and even carved a little serpent around it. Then he took a deep breath, set it to his mouth, and blew. There was music. He pulled it back with a smile and blew again, playing with his fingers and jumping up to look at his handiwork. He laughed and rushed out for the common room where his father and mother sat with his aunts and uncles. He babbled something, then set the pipe to his lips and blew, playing a quick tune that he could dance to. All of them smiled and stood, save his aunts, who cradled their babes, his father clapping his back with a proud laugh before they called for a song. Ben happily obliged, and sent up one that he knew well, letting the rhythm flow through him until every hand clapped to the melody, and their voices rose to sing the words. When it was done, he was panting, but he grinned wider than he ever thought he could, bowing and telling them that he couldn't wait for the festival. And the next day, he proved it true. He left after light, when he knew the peddler, named John, would already be there and ready for customers, nearly knocking 3 people down as he went, and pulled the man's eyes off his task. "What is it, boy?" John asked with a smirk. "I've done it. Last night. Listen, John, listen." He set the pipe to his lips and shut his eyes, playing a simple, somber tune that almost made him want to sleep. When he stopped and found John's face, the man blinked dumbly, mouth open on a slowly rising smile as he stood. Then someone clapped from his side, and it spread. Ben turned to find the vendors and the few customers out in the cold clapping. He smiled, face red and hot, as he bowed and gestured to John. "The pipe came from this man here, if you want one that might sound the like." But no one did come asking after a pipe. Only the girl stepped forward with a sweet smile, though there was something else beneath. "Well, congratulations, boy. It seems I was wrong." "The sound of it! I should make flutes from that wood," John remarked, coming around the table and wrapping his arms around Ben's shoulders. "I'll be rich after I make more of those, boy. Thank you." Then he kissed Ben's temple, pulling up a laugh before John walked back around his table and finished setting up his wares. "Could you play a little more?" she asked, her clothes almost the same as every other day. It was very pretty." "You mean the most beautiful sound you've ever heard?" Ben asked, earning him a sneer before he set the pipe to grinning lips. He played this song and that for what might have been half an hour, and when he stopped, the girl came a little closer and whispered shyly, "Would you play it for me?" Her eyes looked big as they met his own, almost glossy as he breathed the scent of her and swallowed, face warming. He licked his lips and tried stepping back, but his feet suddenly went lame and left him stuck in place. "Shall I, do it here?" "No, stupid." She giggled, then took his hand and led him through the market and the town, looking over her shoulder and smiling when he asked where they were going, never giving answer. They walked through town until they came onto Marching Way and took it west where it met the Hammer, overlooking the wide Lessus River. "Here?" he asked as she pulled him into the grass of a pasture's corner, tugging him between the road and Lessus. "Here," she said. "Play for me, stupid boy." She giggled like it was something they'd always called each other, but the way she smiled made his face hot and his stomach quiver. So he set the pipe to his lips and played, watching as she picked up her arms and danced. She twirled and spun, moving slowly to the sway of the music, taking off her cape when she danced long enough. Then she told him to play something happy, something that he would play at the festival. And he did, smiling when she nodded approvingly at his choice and hopped into a circular dance. She panted after a while and laughed, face beaming as she took his shoulders and pulled him into the dance as well, making them spin around one another until they were close to the water. He smiled around the pipe, licking his lips occasionally and ignoring the sparse stares from a fisherman casting into the current. But finally, Ben stopped the song and panted, plopping himself down and hunching over his legs. The girl stood by his side, smiling, panting, trying to pull him up and telling him that he'd never win any ribbons if that's all that he could do for the festival. Ben waved the remark away with a laugh and grin, but she'd walked closer to the stony shore and took no notice. He shut his eyes and gulped for air, letting the cool wind off the Lessus wash over him and the sweat dripping down his temples. Then the girl returned with crunching grass, and when he looked up to find her, she threw down her raised arm, scowling and quiet as a rock slammed into Ben's head. His eyes went wide, then drooped as he slumped back. The girl atop him as she lifted the rock again, something no bigger than a plum, and brought it down. She beat his head until the stone came away dripping wet, and Ben lay twitching beneath her. All that day, Eleanor Allen thought nothing of her son's absence at home. He often spent his days in the market of late, but once the sun dipped low, she stood from the seat before the hearth and put on her coats. She crossed the little path of grass, dead from cold now, and entered the street for the market, winding this way and that until she found the peddler who'd given Ben his pipe. He said that he'd seen him drug after some girl in the morning and hadn't seen him since. She thanked the man and went the way that he'd said they'd gone, walking what seemed the whole of town until she came to Marching Way and stopped at the gate. She looked one way, then the other, and decided to walk the whole length of the road, nearly sprinting to keep from the dark. But by nightfall, she'd found nothing, and only just made it back to market. When she crossed the street and made it back inside the manse, Will was half frantic, asking after her. She tried to speak, to explain, but he wouldn't listen with all that Allen anger welling up in him. She let out a single, hot-worded shout that shut his mouth and made his brown eyes hold to her blue gaze. She huffed, but the anger that had straightened her back and puffed her chest was gone. She slouched and trembled, walking into Will's arms as he held her close and asked what had happened. "I can't find him. It's not strange for him to be gone, but he's always back by supper." Her voice didn't quiver. She didn't cry. It was almost like she was discussing the weather. "Who? Ben?" She nodded. "The boy's always been home before dark. I'm sure he has a good reason." "What if he's hurt, my heart?" She looked up and found him, hand on the chest of his house robe. "What if he's lying beside the road, struck by a horse? What if he's been playing with the other boys and they rounded up on him? What if he fell from a tree and broke his neck?" Will sighed, hand finding her cheek to stroke the flesh as he pulled her close again and spoke softly. "He's an Allen." "But he doesn't act like you anymore. Ever since that trial, he's—" She sighed and tried to look away, but he held her in place, kissing her forehead and hugging her close. "I'm sure he's fine. And if not, we'll treat him. And if he's playing about in the dark, then we'll teach him." She chuckled at that and nodded against his chest, but she couldn't bring herself to eat much supper, nor sleep long before she had to tiptoe into the common room and stare into the fire. There she slept, and woke again in the middle of the night, before she went back to bed and slept and woke and slept and woke until the sun rose. She dressed quickly, foregoing breakfast to go into market and find the peddler again, but he hadn't seen Ben. She cursed under her breath, but thanked him when he offered to tell her if he saw him. Then she wandered into one of the market's little courts and sat on a step leading down into it. A girl sat across from her, nibbling on a piece of bread and meat from a satchel. She stared at the girl, no older than 16, with a pretty face and blonde hair she kept braided down the back of her mended cape. But when the girl was done with her food, she pulled something from her pocket and smiled as if it were the answer to a great question. She held it, a dark thing, with a glinting metal tip she put to her mouth. Then she blew a single note and shut her eyes, melting into the sultry hum that could have reached out and convinced your heart of anything. She eyed it hungrily, then set it to work again, this time fingering the notes until she had a song, piping it faster and louder with each breath until a small crowd gathered to hear her play. The girl blushed at the attention, but kept playing, remaining sat on the step. Eleanor shut her eyes and grinned, swaying to the tune and thinking of Ben with his own pipe. Then her brows furrowed, and she opened her eyes. She got to her feet and crossed the yard, eyes fixed on the girl and the little dark instrument in her fingers. She parted the crowd until she stood shoulder to shoulder with the rest in the front row, eyes studying the pipe and following the curve of the serpent winding round its length. Her throat closed and she swallowed hard, mouth opening in question and hand about to snatch the pipe from the girl's mouth when 3 long blasts came from the north. They were distant, but the horns must have been massive for how clear they did sound. Everyone went still and turned to Cunning Hill. The horn blasts came thrice more, and Eleanor trembled, eyes moistening and heart skipping a beat as she stepped back and rushed for the manse, calling for any carriage available. There were none, but as Lyda opened the door and asked what was happening, Eleanor spotted a lone horse. "The Cunninghams have found a corpse," she said, untying the reins of the horse from a lamp-post and jumping into its saddle as someone called after her with curses. "I must see if it's Ben." "Eleanor!" Lyda called. "It's only been a day. Eleanor!" But she wouldn't listen, just rode the horse into a hard gallop over the cobblestones, winding through the town and breaking through the north onto Johann's Way Road. She whipped the horse with a mad yah, a dirt cloud rising behind her, carried off by the cold wind until she saw Python Bridge and the crowd of servants and staff alike. She stopped the horse and leapt down, not caring if the creature wandered off. She searched the crowd for a familiar face as they all moved around the south end of the bridge, pushing herself between the folks until she saw one, tall and sombre. "Mistress Esther!" Eleanor called, rushing over to her, chest heaving and heart racing like she'd run the whole way, not the horse. "My son's missing. Is it him?" "Lady Eleanor?" Esther blinked, as if remembering where she was. Then her mouth went tight, and she set her hands on Eleanor's upper arm. We're not sure who it is, but..." Then Eleanor was gone, ripped herself from Esther's grip to push her way through the crowd until she stood on the muddy banks and stopped. Her back was straight and rigid, her mouth hung open slightly, as wide eyes watched the men hoist the corpse into the mud, then drag him into the grass. Face up, eyes open, mouth gaping wide as the gash in the top of his skull. "You think this is who the fishermen saw with that girl?" one of the men asked, looking down on Benjamin's body, though they didn't know him. She let out a breath, and before she could speak, she lunged, half falling down the bank, and collapsed in front of his body. Her voice came in a scream, just his name over and over again, but she couldn't feel herself saying it. Her chest heaved, her insides burned and froze as she clutched at her boy's wet clothes, pulling at his father's coat still clinging to him. She brushed the hair from his face and kissed him, body trembling and breath rattling as she gasped and sobbed, body heaving with each sound as all the world rushed away from her and Benjamin. There was nothing but him and her in that darkness, and it was cold and empty there with his blank stare. Somehow, someone pulled her away and sat her in the grass, speaking like distant whispers as she held Benjamin's face, panting, whimpering. "You think this is who the fishermen saw with that girl?" The staff's voice came in her head. "I haven't seen him, but he went off with some girl this morning. Nasty thing, but pretty," the peddler had told her yesterday. Then she saw the girl sat atop the steps with her food and the pipe. The pipe. Ben's pipe. Next thing she knew, Eleanor was stood in the market, headed for the peddler with no idea how she got there, only the vague memory of talking with Mistress Esther about a horse. She found the man, John he called himself, and stood like a statue of death, fists balled at her sides, as she carefully spoke through her teeth. "The girl. The one my Ben went off with. Do you know her name?" "Miss Allen, lady. Did you hear the blasts?" "The girl," she repeated, her eyes burning and mouth twisted into an ugly scowl. "Her name. Know you it?" He sat still, staring for a moment before he stood with a sigh, fingertips on the table as he held her eyes kindly. "I don't know her name, but I've seen her around, more than not. I think I seen her with Ben's pipes too lately. I know. Know you someone who could name her? Or better, know you're her home? She leaned on the table, hands spreading out the wares across the cloth. I know she's sweet on the fishmongers to get fresh catches for cheap. They could know her name. Could that they know where she stays too, temptress she be. He spat on the floor of his stall and went rigid, apologizing. Eleanor waved it away and thanked him before she turned through the market for River Street, full of foods taken from the Lessus or Python both. She went stall to stall, asking after a pretty young girl with blonde hair. Most knew of her but didn't know her name. Then she found a stall with a young man stocking fish on ice under a cloth awning, for his aged father sat further in the outlet. He was no taller than other men, but he was strong for a boy of his age, no older than 19, and beautiful in a mannish way. Eleanor asked after the girl, and the boy, named Levi, knew her, the more so when she mentioned the little dark wood pipe that she'd started carrying. "Ah, you mean Lucy," Levi had said. "She'd been playing that thing every time she comes to see us." The boy shrugged. "Brings more business, far as I can see." "Comes to see you, boy," his father called from his chair behind the tables. Then he sneered. "Should make an honest woman of her." Levi only laughed and waved his father away. "What can I help you with about it?" "Lucy." Eleanor tried the name and fought the scowl rearing up. She smiled. "Might you know where she lives? I saw her earlier and believe she may have dropped something." "Well, I might give it to her. She comes by often enough." "Oh no, I'd rather do it myself. Her playing is quite good, after all. I hope to catch her in another song, if honest." She fought the bile rising in her throat, and thanked Levi anyway. Then she scanned the fish and bought one from courtesy, taking the waxen parcel in her bare hands and walking away, only to duck into a corner not far off and wait. She watched the fishmonger for an hour, giving the fish to a passerby so it wouldn't go to waste, and grinned something awful when the girl, Lucy, walked up to Levi. They conversed, the boy leaning on the table in his rolled-up sleeves, trying to show her his muscular arms despite the chilled wind at his back. But Lucy played the game well as him, stroking his arm and stepping close with a wide smile, giggling at his jokes and petting him anywhere she could. She even told a few jokes of her own that made Levi wrap an arm around her and pull them together. He kissed her, in view of everyone, and only stopped when she said to, scolding him with a smile. Then Lucy stepped back and pulled Ben's pipe from her pocket. Eleanor's face burned, hands aching with how hard she clenched her fists. But she let the girl play and weave the magic of her son's skill. People came around to hear it and buy from Levi's table while they were there, praising both. And Eleanor watched until dusk, when Lucy took a waxen parcel of fish from Levi and gave him an obscene kiss and a whisper. Eleanor followed her through the market, quiet as a moth with eyes burning like a lion on its prey, silent tears trekking her cheeks and teeth grinding until her jaw ached. "Patience," she reminded herself. "Too many eyes. Patience, woman." And patience gave reward. Before nightfall, Lucy was home, a tenement building in a part of the Upper West Quarter to what Eleanor had never been, going inside and living her life with a smile and glee that Eleanor wanted to peel from her face. She stood between two buildings opposite Lucy's home, watching for sign of which window was hers. Then the girl walked in front of it and pulled it open, a light already on, and set to work with something. Eleanor waited and watched, eyes drying for how long she didn't blink, staring after the girl's face. Colors faded to gray and red as she waited, stirring up one idea after another of what should happen, of how she should pay for her crimes, until full dark had blanketed the quarter and all retired for bed. That's when Eleanor crossed the empty road and walked into the foyer of the tenement, having calculated where the room was based on the position of the window relative to the door, and the time that it took Lucy to get there. With a quick climb of stairs, she found what she believed was the door and tried the handle. Locked. With a whispered curse, she tried the other doors until she came upon a vacant apartment 3 doors down, and entered to go to the window overlooking the street, knife in hand from a drawer. She opened the window and climbed outside, scaling from windowsill to windowsill until she came to Lucy's. She used the knife to undo the latch inside and pushed the frame open, knife dropping to the street below with a twang. She looked after it and sighed angrily but entered anyway, taking off her boots to pad barefoot through the dark house and check behind each door. She found an old couple and a room of 3 other sleepers, none Lucy, before she found the girl asleep on a cot in the corner of the common room. Alone. Eleanor smiled, silently took up the iron stoker from beside the little hearth, and raised it above her head. Then she saw the outline of Ben's whistle on the table beside, and a thought flashed behind her eyes that made her smile something crooked and cold. She chuckled to herself and brought the iron down with a smack to Lucy's forehead. The girl shuddered awake, eyes loose in her head, before Eleanor brought the rod down again and sent the girl back to sleep. Then she went to work. She took up her son's pipe, twisted off the brass bill, and opened the girl's mouth. She shoved it into her gullet, carefully pushing it down with her slender fingers, while she felt Lucy's throat to manipulate it into the right place. Then, setting it where she wanted so that it bulged, Eleanor set the iron back, stepped into her boots, and climbed out the window, headed for home with a smile and something hot and heavy stirring in her chest. The next morning Eleanor waited by her chamber window for the sound of the pipe, but heard nothing. She waited the day after, and the next, but still heard nothing, so she went into market and looked for Lucy, asked John and Levi if they'd seen her, and neither had. So she waited another day, and strolled into the upper west quarter, stopping to watch Lucy's window until she appeared. She was pale, hair disheveled, with tears staining her cheeks as she flicked around and scratched at her throat with a wince. She whimpered, and Eleanor could have sworn to hear a sultry note light from her lips. Eleanor smiled, chuckle becoming a laugh that made her cover her mouth lest she be heard, and thereafter she waited by her window to listen for the pipes, or walked through the market, smiling and content to wait for Lucy to show her face, until one day she heard them. She perked up and smiled a scythe across her face as she turned after the music, following it to one of the market's little courts, and stopping in the middle of a crowd as Lucy stood before another girl, far younger, who spoke for her and shoved her into action. Then Lucy sighed, the low note of the pipe coming from her mouth, before she shut her eyes and let out a slow, practiced song. It was Ben's pipe, Ben's music coming out of her mouth as bitter tears trekked Lucy's stony face. And the people stared, some afraid, some unimpressed at her trick, though some were curious enough to stay. "You may have eyes on you, girl," Eleanor thought, "but you'll never get them for praise anymore. We'll never suffer your voice. Now, you'll suffer us." Then the little girl pulled out a wooden pipe and joined Lucy in the tune. Everyone laughed then, making Lucy falter as red eyes flicked around, angry, then desperate. Soon other children joined in with their own pipes, until there were 10 singing with Lucy, and everyone laughed, and Lucy wept, and Eleanor Allen smiled a cold smile. 11 pipers piping, 10 lords a-leaping, 9 ladies is dancing.